The train had come and gone twice since morning, and Leanne Ju was still sitting on the same bench outside the depot in Silver Creek, Wyoming, in the summer of 1878, wearing a gray cheongsam gone thin at the seams from 3 weeks of travel. She had crossed half a continent to marry a man named Walter Prescott, a mining agent who had written her letters through a matchmaker in San Francisco, letters full of promises about a house with glass windows and a garden she could tend herself. She had believed every word of them. But when her train finally pulled into Silver Creek that morning, no one had been waiting on the platform, and by noon a boy from the telegraph office had found her still sitting there and handed her a folded slip of paper. Prescott had married another woman in Cheyenne 2 days earlier. The telegram did not apologize. It simply informed her, in the clipped language of men who did not think apology was owed, that the arrangement was cancelled and that she should make other plans. She had no other plans. She had $11 sewn into the lining of her travel bag, a single trunk of belongings, and a country 3,000 miles from anything she had ever known. The depot platform emptied out as the afternoon wore on, townsfolk going about their business, most of them sparing her only a glance before looking away, the particular kind of looking away that told her exactly how alone she was in this town. Heat rose off the packed dirt street in visible waves, and somewhere down the block a blacksmith's hammer rang steady against iron, indifferent to the small quiet catastrophe unfolding on a bench outside the depot. She kept her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, because her mother had taught her that grief shown in public was grief handed to strangers to do with as they pleased, and she was not about to give Silver Creek that satisfaction. That was when a shadow fell across the bench, and a man's voice, low and unhurried, broke the silence she had been holding onto like armor. "Don't sit alone, miss. Not out here with the sun going down and half this town not knowing what to make of you yet." She looked up. The man standing there was tall, sun-weathered, dressed in a plain work shirt with dust ground into the knees of his trousers, a battered hat pushed back from his forehead. His eyes were pale, steady, and there was nothing in them that looked like the pity she had been bracing herself against all afternoon. "I am not sitting alone by choice," she said, her English careful and precise, each word chosen with the deliberateness of someone who had learned the language from books before she learned it from people. "The man I came here to marry has married someone else." Something flickered across the stranger's face, not surprise exactly, more like recognition of a particular kind of cruelty he had seen before. "That's so," he said. "Walter Prescott. You know him. Everybody in this county knows him. Knows better than to trust him too, mostly." He crouched down slightly, bringing himself level with her instead of towering over her the way most men did without noticing. "Name's Silas Boone. I run a horse ranch about 6 miles west of here. You got somewhere to sleep tonight, miss?" "Ju," she said. "Leanne Ju." "And no. I do not." Silas was quiet for a moment, studying her the way a man studies a fence line before deciding where to put a post. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over," he said. "Mrs. Halloway runs it fair. I can walk you there, and I can cover the first week if you'll let me, no strings on it. Man ought not leave a woman stranded on a bench just because some other man didn't have the decency to show his face." Leanne studied him carefully, weighing the offer against every instinct that told her kindness from strangers in this country often came with a price attached that revealed itself later. But there was something plain and unadorned in the way he made the offer, no flourish, no expectation visible in his expression, and she found herself standing before she had fully decided to trust him. "I do not need charity," she said. "I will repay you." "Didn't say you wouldn't," Silas said, and something almost like a smile crossed his weathered face. "Come on, then. Sun's going down, and I'd rather get you settled before dark." She had no way of knowing, walking beside a stranger down a dusty street toward an uncertain roof over her head, that the 6 miles between Silver Creek and Silas Boone's ranch would become, within the year, the only distance in this country that had ever felt like it was leading her somewhere worth going. Mrs. Halloway's boarding house smelled of lye soap and wood smoke, and the woman herself, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, looked Leanne over with the frank assessment of someone who had seen every kind of traveler pass through her doors. But whatever judgment she was forming softened the moment Silas explained, briefly and without embellishment, what had happened at the depot. "Prescott's a coward and everybody in 3 counties knows it," Mrs. Halloway said, already reaching for a key off the board behind her desk. "You'll have the room at the end of the hall, Miss Jew. Quietest one. Supper's at 6 if you're hungry." Leanne took the key with a small, careful nod, unused to strangers extending kindness so plainly, without calculation behind it. That first night she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and unpacked only what she needed, leaving the rest of her trunk closed, uncertain whether Silver Creek would prove to be a place worth unpacking fully into or simply another stop on a road she had not chosen. The room held a washstand, a small mirror gone cloudy at the edges, and a single window that looked out over the dusty stretch of the town's main street, and she lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, listening to sounds she did not recognize yet, the creak of a windmill somewhere beyond the rooftops, a dog barking twice and falling silent, the particular hush of a frontier town settling into night. She thanked Silas at the door the following morning, expecting that to be the last she saw of him, expecting the ordinary indifference of a country that had already made clear how little it expected of her. But Silas returned the next morning, and the morning after that, always with some practical reason. A line on work at the mercantile that might suit her, since he had heard she could read and write both English and her own tongue, a skill that made her valuable to a town whose ledger-keeper had died of fever the previous winter. A word to the mercantile owner, a heavy-set man named Otis Granger, who ran the only general store in Silver Creek and who needed someone sharp with numbers now that his old clerk was gone. Granger hired her within the week, skeptical at first, watching her the way most of the town watched her, but by the end of her second day balancing his accounts, correcting 3 errors that had gone unnoticed for months, his skepticism had curdled into something closer to grudging respect. "You're better with these books than the last 3 men I hired," Granger admitted, gruff, unwilling to make it sound like a compliment even though it plainly was. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Silver Creek, and within a month Leanne had become a fixture behind the mercantile counter, precise and quietly competent, earning a wage that let her repay Silas for the boarding house within 6 weeks, exactly as she had promised. She handed him the money folded neatly in a handkerchief, and he took it without comment, though something in his expression suggested he had not fully expected her to insist. "Told you there weren't strings on it," he said. "I know," Leanne said. "I still needed to pay it." It was during those weeks that she began to understand who Silas Boone actually was, beyond the plain kindness of that first evening. He came into town most Saturdays to sell horses, and she watched from the mercantile window as men who ran the town's larger operations, ranchers with more land and more cattle than he had, treated him with a wary respect that had nothing to do with his modest holdings and everything to do with something else entirely, something she could not yet name. She learned the shape of it one afternoon when a drunk drover named Cyrus Deal started harassing one of the mercantile's younger customers outside the store, grabbing at her wrist hard enough to bruise, and Silas crossed the street before anyone else in town had even finished registering what was happening. He did not shout. He did not draw the pistol at his hip. He simply put himself between Deal and the woman, said something too low for Leanne to hear from the window, and Deal backed away with his hands raised, the color gone entirely from his face. "What did you say to him?" Leanne asked later, when Silas came into the store to settle an account. "Told him the truth," Silas said. "That I'd remember his face the next time he thought about doing that to somebody, and that I don't forget faces." There was nothing more to it than that, no violence, no raised voice, but the entire street had gone quiet watching it happen, and Leanne understood, standing behind that counter, that whatever reputation Silas Boone carried in this town, it ran considerably deeper than horse ranching. She did not ask further. She had learned, in her own life, that some things surfaced in their own time, when a person was ready to say them plainly instead of being pressed into an answer before they trusted the ground beneath the question. In the weeks that followed, she began noticing other small things about him that confirmed what the town's wary respect had already suggested. The way he counted exits in any room he entered, a habit so ingrained he seemed unaware he was doing it. The way he never sat with his back to a door, choosing instead the chair that let him watch the street through the mercantile's front window while they reviewed accounts together on slow afternoons. The way older men in town, ranchers twice his age with far larger holdings, still deferred to his judgment whenever a dispute needed settling, calling him in the way a town calls in a doctor, someone whose opinion carried weight beyond what his modest spread of land would suggest on its own. She filed each detail away carefully, the same instinct that had once made her a careful reader of contracts now turned toward reading the quiet, careful man who had pulled her off that bench and refused to let the town's indifference decide what happened to her next. The truth surfaced on a hot afternoon in late July, when Silas asked her to ride out to the ranch to help settle a dispute over a horse sale, a task that required someone who could read a contract carefully and catch any language slipped in against his interest. She had never seen his land before, 6 miles of scrubland and open pasture that he had built up over a decade of work, a modest but well-kept spread with a clapboard house and a corral that held some of the finest horses she had seen since arriving in this country. It was there, sitting across from him at his kitchen table while they reviewed the contract line by line, that he finally told her the rest of it. "I used to ride for the county as a deputy marshal," he said, not looking up from the papers. 6 years. Left it 3 years back after a manhunt went bad and a man died who didn't need to. Fella I was chasing turned out to be innocent of what they'd accused him of, and by the time the truth came out, it was too late to give him his life back. I put down the badge after that. Told myself I was done deciding who deserved trouble and who didn't. Leanne set down her pen carefully. "That is why Deal backed away from you so fast." "Word travels," Silas said. "Man doesn't forget who used to enforce the law around here, even after he stops doing it. I don't mind that reputation working in my favor when it keeps someone from getting hurt. I just don't go looking to use it otherwise." It was the most he had told her about himself since the day they met, unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, and she understood that this admission had cost him something, the way honesty always costs something to men who kept themselves as carefully composed as Silas did. "You blame yourself still," she said. It was not a question. "Every day," he said. "Man's life ended because I moved too fast on bad information. That's not the kind of thing that stops sitting with you just because you quit the job." She thought, then, of the $11 sewn into her travel bag, of the letters from Walter Prescott she had believed without question, of every choice she had made trusting the wrong information at the wrong moment, and she found herself understanding his guilt more completely than she expected to. "I trusted a man's letters and crossed an ocean and half a continent because of them," she said. "I understand what it is to move on information that turns out false. The difference is you carry a life in the balance of yours. I only carried my own foolishness." "Wasn't foolish," Silas said, finally looking up at her. "Wasn't foolish to believe a man ought to keep his word. That's not a flaw in you. That's a flaw in him." Something passed between them in that quiet kitchen, the summer heat pressing through the open window, the contract forgotten on the table between them, and Leanne felt, for the first time since stepping off that train, something loosen in her chest that she had been holding taut since the moment the telegram arrived. That evening, as she prepared to ride back into town before dark, Silas walked her out to the horses, and at the gate, he paused, his hand resting on the rail rather than reaching for her, careful in a way that told her he understood exactly how much trust he was asking her to extend. "I'm not looking to rush you into anything," he said. "You've had enough men make promises they didn't keep. I'd rather earn whatever you're willing to give me, slow, than ask for it before you're ready." "I know," Leanne said. "That is precisely why I trust you already." She rode back to town in the fading light with her pulse unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the horse beneath her, understanding that whatever had begun in that quiet kitchen was not something she could undo simply by returning to her ordinary life behind the mercantile counter. The trouble arrived in August, in the shape of Walter Prescott himself, who rode into Silver Creek with his new wife on his arm and a business proposition for the town council that would see the mercantile supply contracts routed through his mining company instead of the independent freighters Granger had always used. It was, on its surface, an ordinary piece of frontier commerce. Beneath it, as Leanne discovered within days of reviewing the paperwork Granger asked her to examine, it was something else entirely. The contract Prescott proposed contained a clause, buried deep in language designed to be skimmed past rather than read carefully, that would give his company the right to seize the mercantile's inventory as collateral if a single shipment ran late, regardless of whose fault the delay was. It was the kind of clause that could ruin Granger within a season if Prescott ever chose to enforce it, and given what Leanne already knew of the man's character, she did not doubt for a moment that he would choose to. She brought it to Granger immediately, laying out the language clause by clause, and watched the older man's face go pale as he understood exactly what he had nearly signed. "That snake," Granger muttered. "Thought he could slide this past me because I never learned to read contracts the way you do." "He counted on it," Leanne said. "He is counting on everyone in this town underestimating what is written in front of them." Word of the exposed contract spread through Silver Creek within a day, and Prescott, cornered and humiliated in front of the very town council he had hoped to impress, did not take the exposure quietly. He came to the Mercantile himself 2 days later, his new wife absent, his composure thinner than Leanne had seen it, and he stood in the doorway with an expression that made the temperature of the room drop several degrees before he said a single word. "You've made yourself a problem, Miss Jew," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she and Granger, working nearby, could hear it clearly. A foreign woman with no standing in this territory, meddling in contracts that were none of her concern. "I could make things considerably harder for you than they already are." "You already tried that once," Leanne said, steady, refusing to let her voice betray the pulse hammering beneath her collar. "You left me on a train platform with nothing but a folded telegram." "I do not frighten as easily as you seem to believe." Prescott's jaw tightened, and for a moment Leanne thought he might say something worse, something designed to wound rather than threaten, but the bell over the door rang before he could, and Silas Boone stepped into the Mercantile with the particular quiet stillness she had come to recognize as the calm before he moved. "Prescott," Silas said, nothing more than the name, but something in his tone made the mining agent's shoulders draw up defensively. "Boone. This doesn't concern you." "Everything that happens to the people in this town concerns me," Silas said. "Especially when it's you doing the happening. Miss Jew caught your contract fair and square. Nothing illegal in reading carefully. If you've got a complaint about that, take it up with the council, not with a woman working an honest job behind a counter." Prescott's eyes moved between them, calculating, and whatever he saw in Silas Boone's expression made him recalculate whatever threat he had been preparing to deliver. He left without another word, the bell over the door ringing sharp behind him, and the Mercantile settled back into its ordinary quiet, though Leanne's hands did not stop trembling for several minutes afterward. "He is not finished," she said, once Prescott's footsteps had faded outside. "No," Silas agreed. "Men like that rarely are, not when they've been made to look foolish in front of a town. We'll need to be ready for whatever he tries next." She did not yet know how right he would prove to be, or how close that readiness would come to costing them both everything. Prescott's retaliation came a week later, and it came in a form neither of them had anticipated. 2 of his hired men rode out to Silas's ranch under cover of darkness and set fire to the hay barn, a blaze that threatened not only the season's feed but the horses stabled nearby if the wind carried the flames the wrong direction. Leanne was staying in town when the smoke was spotted from the ridge above Silver Creek, the column of it visible even in the dark against the orange glow beneath, and she did not wait for anyone's permission before saddling the Mercantile's delivery horse and riding hard for the ranch, her heart hammering against her ribs the entire 6 miles. By the time she arrived, Silas and 2 of his ranch hands were already fighting the blaze, buckets and wet blankets against a fire that had already claimed half the barn's roof, and the horses inside were screaming in a way that cut straight through the chaos and the smoke. The heat rolled off the burning structure in waves she could feel from 30 yards out, and the air tasted of scorched hay and hot iron, a smell she would remember for the rest of her life every time she caught the faintest trace of wood smoke on an autumn wind. Leanne did not hesitate. She threw herself from the horse, grabbed a wet feed sack from the trough, and moved straight into the smoke toward the stalls, working the latches free one by one while Silas shouted at her to get back, his voice raw with a fear she had never heard in him before. She did not get back. She freed the last horse just as a support beam gave way behind her, and Silas's arm closed around her waist an instant later, hauling her clear as the section of roof collapsed in a shower of sparks exactly where she had been standing. They fell together into the dirt of the corral, coughing, soot-streaked, the horses scattering safely around them into the open pasture, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, both of them simply breathing, alive, the barn behind them a loss but not the catastrophe it had nearly become. "You could have died in there," Silas said, his voice rough, his hand still gripping her arm as though he could not quite make himself let go. "So could the horses," Leanne said. I was not going to stand outside and listen to them burn. He looked at her then, something fierce and unguarded moving across his face, stripped entirely of the careful composure he usually kept. I have buried people I failed to save in time, he said. I am not going to bury you too. Not over Prescott's cowardice. You did not fail tonight, she said. The barn burned. Nobody else did. He pulled her against him then, no hesitation left in it, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, something that had clearly been building since the day she stepped off that train platform. I told myself I was going to earn this slow, he said. I do not know how much slower I have left in me. Watching you run into a burning barn like your own life didn't matter to you. It matters, Leanne said. It matters to me because of what I have found here. You. This town. A life I chose instead of one that was arranged for me by strangers. The fire behind them burned down to embers as they sat together in the dirt of the corral, and when Silas finally leaned in to kiss her, it was not gentle exactly, but certain, the kind of certainty that came only after two people had watched each other risk everything and found, on the other side of that risk, exactly what they had been circling toward all along. The following morning, the sheriff rode out to investigate the fire, and it did not take long, given two witnesses among the townsfolk who had seen Prescott's hired men riding hard toward the ranch the night before, for the truth to surface entirely. Prescott's business dealings, already under quiet scrutiny after the contract scandal, collapsed within the month once the arson charge became public knowledge, and he and his new wife left the territory entirely rather than face trial before a judge who had already heard enough about his character to have little patience left for excuses. In the days that followed, Silver Creek settled back into its ordinary rhythm, though something in the town's regard for Leanne had shifted permanently. Women who had once nodded to her politely and nothing more now stopped to ask after her at the mercantile counter, and Granger began introducing her to visiting merchants as the finest bookkeeper in the territory, a claim he made with the particular pride of a man who knew exactly how close he had come to losing everything before she caught Prescott's contract. Silas rode into town most evenings that week, ostensibly to help with the rebuilding of the barn supply orders, though both of them understood the visits had become about considerably more than lumber and nails. They spent long evenings on the mercantile's back porch once Granger had locked up for the night, Silas teaching her the names of the constellations visible over the Wyoming plains, Leanne teaching him in turn the few words of her own language she was willing to share, small and private things neither of them offered easily to anyone else. It was during one of those quiet evenings, the crickets loud in the dark beyond the porch rail, that Silas finally asked her the question he had clearly been carrying since the night of the fire. I know a proper man would have taken more time working up to this, he said, turning his hat over slowly in his hands, an unfamiliar nervousness sitting oddly on a man who usually carried himself with such settled certainty. But I have spent a decade building that ranch alone, telling myself I did not need anything more than horses and open land to call a life worth having. I do not believe that anymore. Not since you rode out to that fire without waiting to be asked. Are you asking me something, Silas Boone? Leanne said, though she already knew the answer waiting behind his words. I am asking if you would consider building the rest of it with me, he said. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Because I cannot picture the rest of my years out there without you in them. She did not answer him right away, letting the silence stretch the way she had learned, in this country, that important answers deserved a moment of stillness before they were given. Then she reached across the small space between them and took his hand, steady, deliberate, the same way she had taken the mercantile's ledgers into her care the first week she arrived in Silver Creek, with full intention and no hesitation left in her once the decision was made. Yes, she said simply. I will build it with you. He kissed her then, careful still, though the hesitation that had marked every gesture between them since the fire had finally given way to something settled and sure, and the crickets kept their steady chorus in the dark beyond the porch rail as if the whole quiet night had simply been waiting for them to arrive at this particular answer. For months later, in the last warmth of a Wyoming autumn, Leanne stood in front of a rebuilt barn that smelled of fresh-cut timber instead of smoke, watching Silas walk a new mare through the corral with the same patient steadiness he brought to everything he touched. The mercantile had thrived through the season, Granger's business more solid than it had been in years now that Leanne managed the books full-time, and the town of Silver Creek, which had once looked at her with wary uncertainty on a bench outside the depot, now greeted her by name whenever she walked its main street. She had married Silas in the small clapboard church at the edge of town 2 months earlier, no grand ceremony, just Mrs. Halloway and Granger and a handful of townsfolk who had come to know her through a year of quiet, steady work, and a preacher who had remarked, before the vows, that he had rarely seen two people arrive at a marriage having already proven, through fire and hardship, exactly what kind of partners they intended to be. The ranch had grown too. 3 new horses added to the herd, a second hand hired to help with the increased demand for Silas's stock now that word of his careful breeding had spread further through the territory, and the house itself had a new set of glass windows in the front room, installed the month before, the kind of small comfortable prosperity that would have seemed impossible to Leanne on that first afternoon sitting alone on a train platform bench. Granger had made her a full partner in the mercantile that same autumn, a decision that raised eyebrows among the more traditional voices in Silver Creek, though the ledgers spoke plainly enough that few dared argue with the arrangement out loud. She kept her own set of keys to the store now, opened it most mornings before Granger arrived, and the townsfolk who once looked past her without a word now greeted her by name as a matter of course, some even seeking her out specifically when a contract needed careful reading before a signature went on it. She kept the folded telegram from Walter Prescott in the bottom of her travel trunk still, not out of sentiment but as a reminder of exactly how far a single afternoon of abandonment had carried her, toward a life built on her own choices rather than a marriage arranged sight unseen by strangers with promises they never intended to keep. She had thought, on that first afternoon at the depot, that her life had narrowed to nothing. Instead it had opened into something wider than any letter from a stranger could have promised her. "You're thinking too hard again," Silas said, catching her watching him from the fence rail, the new mare nudging at his shoulder with the easy trust of an animal that had learned, quickly, what kind of hands were holding its lead. The afternoon sun caught the pale color of his eyes the way it had that first evening outside the depot, though nothing about the way he looked at her now carried even a trace of the wary caution a stranger owes another stranger. "I am thinking about how close I came to never sitting down on that bench at all," Leanne said. "I nearly walked into the depot office to ask about the next train back east, before you found me." The memory still carried a strange weight, the way a road not taken sometimes does, even years after the choice had settled itself firmly in favor of staying. "Glad you didn't," Silas said, crossing the yard to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything. "So am I," she said. The autumn light settled gold over the ranch, over the rebuilt barn and the new windows and the 6 miles of scrubland Silas had spent a decade turning into something worth staying for, and Leanne understood, standing there with her husband's hand in hers, that the life she had been promised in Walter Prescott's letters had never once been real. This one was. Built slow, tested by fire, chosen deliberately by 2 people who had learned, the hard way, exactly what kind of partner was worth the risk of trusting again. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before the ranch woke fully into its day, Leanne would sit at the kitchen table where Silas had first told her the truth about the badge he no longer wore, and she would think of the woman who had sat alone on that depot bench, certain her life had ended before it truly began. That woman could not have imagined the mercantile ledgers now bearing her name as partner, or the rebuilt barn standing solid against the Wyoming sky, or a husband who had chosen to earn her trust slowly rather than demand it outright. Silver Creek had taught her that a life abandoned by one man was not a life ended, only a life waiting to be claimed by someone willing to build it honestly, one deliberate choice at a time. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.